So, second part of the war, we talked about the German part of the war where the United States and the communists ultimately joined together to stop Hitler and his acts of expansion. Basically, there's two wars going on at one time. There's the Allied war against the Germans in Europe, and then there's the war against the Japanese. We said the Japanese started fighting in 1931, 1937. 1931, they take over Korea and Manchuria. 1937, they attack China itself, and they're trying to build their own imperial empire. Um, they eventually get to a crossroads where if they're going to continue to expand, they're going to have to go into territory the United States is controlling and is not interested in letting Japan expand into, specifically the Philippines. The Philippines, you'll remember, is this island group that the United States had taken from Spain in 1899, and we still controlled it. And this was definitely something that the Japanese were looking to, an area where the Japanese were looking to expand to. Well, once the Japanese had made the decision that a war with the United States was inevitable, they tried to launch a surprise naval attack against the United States at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. They hoped to sink our entire fleet. It's only partially successful. After the shock of Pearl Harbor, the United States rebuilt its navy very quickly, and it's only a matter of time. When the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, it was fundamentally a death sentence for them. I'm going to come back to this slide, but I want to show you a map. This is what Japan's empire looked at after its height. This is Hawaii. This is Pearl Harbor. They secretly attacked Pearl Harbor, and then they used that time as the United States was rebuilding its strength to build this massive Pacific empire. You'll notice they have Korea, Manchuria. They have very large population centers in China they're using for resources. They conquered the Philippines from the United States. They captured Indonesia. But once the United States gets involved, Japan's industry is a fraction of the United States. Japan's population is smaller than ours. Their technology isn't as advanced. And the United States is slowly able to take over key islands and get our military closer and closer to Japan itself. Eventually, the United States, as we talked about in our last lesson, is going to get close enough to Japan where we can actually start firebombing major centers of industrialization that's producing war goods in Japan, like Tokyo. But it's not just Tokyo that's destroyed by American firebombing. It's dozens and dozens and dozens of other cities. And yes, we're destroying the Japanese capability to commit to fight, but we're also, a byproduct of that is thousands of civilians are being killed in the process. Now, again, before anybody feels too sorry about those civilians, just present both sides of the story. The Japanese are genociders. We're going to talk about some of the genocides they commit, but they're doing unspeakable atrocities to the Chinese people during their occupation of China. 20 million Chinese are going to die during the Japanese occupation of China. So, full disclosure, they're absolutely genociders, every bit as bad as the Germans were. So that's the flip. Now, does that mean that their civilian population has a right to be targeted? Again, that's a discussion I'm going to leave for you guys. I just want to show both sides of the story. I mean, there is a huge argument made that these people need to be stopped at all, in all consequences, whatever it takes. So Germany gives up first, and this gets us to an important little timeline, I think. Germany surrenders in 1945. Japan has not. By April of 1945, the United States had conquered key islands very, very close to Japan, famously Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And we're close enough to Japan where we can actually launch an invasion of Japan itself. Here's the big picture question. How do we do it? One of the things that was very disheartening for the American military is everyone realized the Japanese were defeated, except the Japanese. Their cities were in ruin, but every time we attacked an island closer and closer and closer to Japan, the Japanese fought harder and harder and harder. And they started to use suicide bombers widespread, where these fanatics would get into an airplane loaded with bombs. They just try to find an American ship to slam it into, knowing that they would die in the process, but they didn't care. So there was this really big fear in the summer of 1945, as we're planning an attack on Japan, that it could get really, 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 really ugly. American military planners who are trying to plan for an invasion of Japan are afraid that if the Japanese continue to fight this hard, there could be 1 million American casualties in an attack on Japan itself. But we're not fighting Germany anymore, so we can go at them now with everything we have. But then some things happened in the summer of 1945. Number one, the president of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, he passes away. So the leader who'd seen us through the war dies, and now his vice president, Harry Truman, becomes president of the United States. And the first thing that he has to deal with as president is, how are we going to end this war with Japan? Well, the second thing that happens in the summer of 1945 was this. The United States had a top secret plan that goes all the way back to 1938 in a letter that Albert Einstein himself had written to the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt, about the possibilities of building an atomic bomb. Now, after this, Einstein has nothing to do with building the bomb. He didn't even know that was going on. He just told the president, you could probably theoretically do this, and I think the Nazis are trying. So the United States starts, and by the way, the Nazis were trying. So the United States starts to secretly have this program to build a nuclear bomb called the Manhattan Project, with the hopes of beating the Germans to the bomb. Well, Germany surrenders, and then a couple months later, the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb occurs in the summer of 1945. And now this presents the United States with another option to end the war. And now the question is, do we invade Japan, or do we drop a nuclear bomb on them? And this is the decision that Wilson had to make himself. And I can't imagine a more difficult decision. On the one hand, if we attack, 1 million Americans are going to die, and probably millions of Japanese are going to die. Or we can drop these 2 atomic bombs on these 2 cities. Hopefully that will end the war, and we won't have any more American deaths. Now, there were some other complicated things to consider about this. The Soviets, now that they weren't fighting the Germans, they had actually started to attack some northern Japanese islands, and there was a fear that if we didn't end the war quickly, the Soviets would attack and conquer Japan and make it communist, which for a variety of reasons was not something the United States was interested in. You could also argue that it would be in the best interest of Japan itself to be conquered by the United States and not the Soviets. There's some humanitarian arguments to be made. There's actually an interesting argument to be made that dropping the nuclear bombs on these 2 cities was actually the best option for Japan, and that it probably saved hundreds and hundreds of thousands of lives. The argument is, when the 2 nuclear bombs were dropped, about 50,000 people die in each city, about 100,000 deaths. Well, how many Japanese would die from an American invasion of Japan? And the answer is probably millions. So I don't want to say that humanitarianism was the reason for why we ultimately do this, but there is an argument that this was the way that actually ended the war and the fewest deaths for both sides. The flip side is it ever moral to use an atomic bomb? And that's an interesting and complex question, and I'm not going to give you the answer to that. You can research this and you can develop those ideas on your own. But this, just to show you the damage, on the right is the city of Hiroshima after the atomic bomb was dropped. The United States is the first and only country to use an atomic weapon in a war. And again, you can argue, hey, you should never use atomic weapons. And I'll be honest with you, I can listen to that argument. Or you can argue these people were murdering millions, and every day that we don't stop them, more innocent people in China are dying. And I can listen to that argument too. So it's not simple. I will say this. The bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are a fraction of the size that we have now. These bombs destroyed about a 3 to 5 square mile area. They did an incredible amount of damage. The world never seen anything like it. But it's not nearly as to the level of what we have now. Now we have these hydrogen bombs that if you dropped one on Atlanta, people in Columbus would die. And that's a whole other scary world we live in right now. But the end result is using the atomic bombs ended the war quickly and led to the Japanese surrender to the United States, not to the Soviets who were threatening to come in and invade. And that's going to have repercussions that we'll talk about in the post-World War II world. So let's look at outcomes. Outcome one, the Allies win. Who were the biggest countries most responsible for the victory? The United States and the Soviets. Biggest is to the British. Wartime casualties. 80 million people are going to die in World War II. All over the world. Only a third of these deaths were soldiers in combat. So there's a civilian toll that World War II takes that we've never seen before. Civilians die in targeted attacks, like the German bombings of London, or like American firebombing of Tokyo. Famine, disease, but also genocides. Both the Japanese and the Germans are responsible for genocides. And I honestly think the Japanese have gotten way too big of a pass for what they've done, what they did in the war. They actually murder more civilians of occupied territory in China and in Indonesia than even the Nazis did. 20 million Chinese, 4 million Indonesians died during the Japanese occupation of those places. That's a genocide. Targeting civilians, purposely keeping food and medical supplies from them. In some cases, purposeful murdering of civilians. The Japanese have gotten a huge pass for this. And the biggest reason I would say that they did was because they are perpetuating these genocides against other Asians. And in the case of China, China's going to become communist very quickly after World War II, and they're going to be perceived as an enemy. So the story of what happened in China at the hands of the Japanese gets overlooked for a variety of reasons. Now, the most famous genocide is what the Nazis do to Jewish populations. Any territory the Nazis conquer, in France, in Poland especially, in the Soviet Union, where they find Jewish populations, they're going to round the Jews up and send them to concentration camps. And in what is called the final solution, they're going to murder, cold-blooded murder, somewhere in the vicinity of 6 to 9 million European Jews. Shootings, but most famously the gas chambers at the concentration camps, like in Auschwitz. So there's huge civilian losses at the hands of the Axis powers, and it's an atrocity. This right here is a famous picture from Jews who were in Auschwitz in these concentration camps. There were dozens and dozens of these camps that were all just basically murder facilities for the Nazis, mostly in Eastern Europe. I want to just show you the death toll of this. The two countries that pay the highest cost in human life in World War II, and remember this, is the Soviet Union and China. In both places, the majority of the deaths were civilian. If you look at this right here, this red is Soviet military casualties. They have the most military casualties, around 11 million dead. They were incredibly ineptly led early in the war. You remember telling you that right before the war, Stalin killed all of his leading military officers in something called the Great Purge. Well, that led to a lot of Soviet disasters early on. But then look at this: another 12 million people are killed. Another 22. Another 12 million people are killed as a result of the civilian populations are killed as a result of the war. Many of these are Jews rounded up and murdered. Many of them are other ethnicities in the Soviet Union. The Germans don't like. They murder in mass. China, relatively speaking, this dark red, very few military casualties. But look at the civilian dead. Versus a country like the United States, who our population was so far away from the battlefields. We had several 100,000 dead. I don't want to minimize that. But the human cost for a country like the United States in this war was much, much smaller than what you would have seen in these other places. Look at Germany. They have a large civilian death toll. Now, before we feel too sorry about that, part of the German civilian death toll is their own Jews they rounded up and murdered. So it wasn't like we killed those civilians, but there were definitely, as part of this death toll, civilians killed in firebombing of German cities like in Dresden. Almost all of the Japanese civilian deaths were a result of American firebombing. So it's a war unlike any other. It's a war on civilian populations. It was long, it was bloody. It's going to lead to a massive change in world power. At the start of the 20th century, if we said, who are the most powerful countries on earth? We would have said, Britain, France, Germany, United States, Russia, Japan. At the end of World War II, you're going to say, who are the most powerful countries on earth? You're going to say the United States and the Soviet Union. And everybody else is just kind of left in the dust. So you're seeing a major transformation in global power that's already taken place in the 20th century. And it's going to set the table for many of the events that take place for the rest of the 20th century. And most importantly, it leads to our next major conflict called the Cold War. But that's a story we'll get to on another day. Y'all have a great day. Stick around for your work. Hope you guys have enjoyed this. And now we're going to really start to look at modern history in the next couple of days.